Chapter 10. What is the history of America's struggle for the educational opportunity? To understand the present U.S. educational system, its successes and failures of the problem it still faces, we must look to our past. There we can identify the forces that have affected and continue to affect and development of American education. This chapter reviews the history of schooling and education in the United States, pointing out 7 important themes and examining the contributions that significant men and women have made. Whereas college students who feel the burning urgency to answer the question, what is the history of American education? Unless you are a history buff, you will probably ask yourself, what do I need to know this stuff? How will it help me do a better job in the classroom? First, understanding American educational history will give you a sense of preservative. As educators, we are sometimes accused of being faddists, which implies that we blindly follow each new approach or idea, thinking it is the greatest thing since the internet. As the other extreme, we are sometimes accused of reinventing the wheel, spending a great deal of energy discovering something that has been in the educational literature for over years or something it part of the education program or a different culture. Second, studying the history of American education will enable you to better understand the culture of a context in which you will work. It will help you see the big picture. That is why things operate as they do in today's schools. Finally, studying the history of education will help you appreciate the truly noble heritage. Schools have been a progressive instrument in the lives of most people who have attended them. They have freed from people from superstition and false information and given them new skills, positive values, and world-expanding visions of what each individual as well as what we as people can become. Some of the greatest people who have walked the earth, Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, among others, saw themselves essentially as teachers. Teachers then are a part of a long-lived, progressive, and inspirational human endeavor. Knowing our educational history and gaining a historical perspective will help you live up to and extend this tradition. Themes in American education. Kindergarten or nursery school led to elementary, then middle school, or junior high school, then to high school, or now to college. You may have taken this progression for granted, assuming that's why the things you have always been. In reality, you are presently enjoying a level of education that was valuable only to the elite or earlier generations. You are already close to the top of the educational pyramid for which the foundation was almost laid 350 years ago. The growth of the pyramid has been shaped and energized by 7 major themes in America educational history. New England town and district schools. In New England, the Puritans believed it was important that everyone be able to read the Bible and interpret its teachings. As early as 1642, Massachusetts passed a law requiring parents to educate their children. The law was strengthened in 1647 by the famous Old Elder Satan Act, because a Satan surely will try to be taught how to read. Therefore, every town or 50 or more families was obligated to pay a man to teach their reading and writing. With these schools, known as town schools, New England set the precedent that if the parents would not or could not educate their children, the government was obligated to take on that responsibility. When settlers spread out seeking better farmland, the town schools began to disappear. What emerged in their place was the so-called moving school, in which a schoolmaster traveled from village to village, holding sets in each place for several months before moving on. Disconnect with the system of education eventually led to the development of the district school. Under this scheme, a township was divided into districts, each having its own school and teacher and being founded by its own town treasury. The theme of district system soon entrenched itself in New England because it was expensive to finance and gives the measure of schooling to every child. Laws made attendance compulsory, but they did not very rigorously enforced. Some towns allowed girls to have 1 or 2 more hours of instruction between 5 and 7 a.m. when the boys were not using the school building. For the most part, however, girls had no access to the town elementary schools until the American Revolution. If few girls went to school in the towns, ever few did so in the outgoing districts. The theme of the universal education was included girls was not to develop until the next century. Students entered school around age 6 or 7 and stayed in school for only 3 or 4 years. They learned their ABCs, numerals, and Lord's Prayer from a horn book, which consisted of a page that was laminated with a transcript material made from boiled down cow's horns and then attached to a flat piece of wood. Having learned the basics, students graduated from the New England Primary Administrative Book and composed a religious text and other readings. Although the primary catechism existed in New England, Primer was the most famous and reminded the basic school text for the last 100 years after the first edition was published in 1690. The learning atmosphere of these colonial schools was repossessive and grim. Students were under orders to keep quiet and do their work, and learning was characterized by an emphasis on memorization. If students did well, they were praised and given a new task. If they did poorly, they were criticized harshly and often given a rap across knuckles or on the seat of the pants. If children did not pay attention, their lack of focus was taken as a sign of how easily the devil could distract them from the path of righteousness. Such views continue to serve as justifications of severe classroom discipline throughout the first 250 years of American history. Education in the South. Conditions in the South were quite different from the New England. Many upper-class Englishmen emigrated to the South where they established large estates, as opposed to the more centralized conditions in New England. The great distance between southern settlements encouraged plantation owners to educate their children with private tutors, who were often local ministers or entrance scholars. As an agent, education of the poor and orphans were often undertaken by evangelical church or by religious groups such as Society for the Propaganda of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. The Society's main mission was to convert natives and enslaved to Christianity. Most Southern settlers were members of the Anglican Church and did not share the Puritan belief that everyone had a religious obligation to learn to read. The lack of concern for general education of the entire community caused public education in the South to lag behind that of the other regions in the country for many generations. Town governments established schools, but their administration was usually delegated to a group or corporation which could collect tuition, own property, hire and fire teachers, and decide curriculum content. Arguments for the common school. After the American Revolution, it was recognized that the democratic government would only be as strong as the people's ability to make intelligent choices, which in turn depended on a basic education for all. It was also argued that education was a naturally right, just like the very rights for which the Revolution had fought. During this period, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson suggested educational plans as did other leaders in Revolution. This early period of the independence also saw an increased concern with citizenship and nationhood. Leaders perceived that a system of common schooling would strengthen the new nation's unity and influx of immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s following a period of upheaval in Europe. Further stimulated demand for an educational system that would serve to Americanize the waves of foreigners and keep U.S. society stable. In contrast to European social structure, class membership in America was rather fluid. Wealth and social status in the country depended less on the social class into which a person was born. Universal education, one of the key themes of American education, was thus seen by the newly evolving working class as given for this spreading educational opportunity. What was better educated people would increase productivity and enhance everyone's prosperity with diminishing crime and reduce poverty. In fact, school materials of the time reflected this argument, whereas the New England primer reflected the ridiculous orientation of how much colonial education. The textbooks of the 19th century began a trend toward secular education and others. Although at this time universal education was meant only for whites, the same arguments advanced as advocates were used later to extend equal opportunities for education to include racial and ethnic minorities and children with disabilities, to name just a few groups that have been denied equal educational opportunities in the past. The desegregation efforts of the 1960s and the 1970s, for example, were based on these very arguments. Victory of the Common School. Between 1820 and 1920, the establishment of common schools made steady progress across the United States. By the middle of the 19th century, and certainly by the end of the Civil War, thanks to in large part of the efforts of Horace Mann, who was profited in the leader's educational future, and other advocates of the common school, the idea of the universal elementary education was generally acknowledged, if not universally practiced, by 1930. 11 states and the districts of Columbia have passed compulsory attendance law in addition to making common schools generally available. European influences. From Europe come to new ideas on education. One of the most far-reaching experiments was the kindergarten or the children's garden, where the pleasant children's activities such as songs and stories were used by the lay foundation before formal education began. Friedrich Froebel in Germany developed the first kindergarten in 1837. The first U.S. experiments with this sort of education were actually made before the Civil War, but it was not until 1870 that a public school kindergarten was established in St. Louis, and the idea spread rapidly. Elizabeth Peabody brought Froebel's ideas in the United States and was influenced by instituting early childhood education in the country. European influence also resulted in a greater emphasis on the interest of the child as elementary education. Johann Petzolzoli modeled his educational doctrines on the Swiss experimental school at the beginning of the 19th century. Petzolzoli attempted to educate their head, hearts, and hands on the people, relying on attitudes of acceptance and love of the individual, student to reach large numbers of poor and handicapped children. Among his instructional techniques were object lessons, which focused on actual objects and pictures. Pasolini also emphasized learning through sense of perceptions and sequencing of learning experience to the known to the known. We can still see the American education and influence of many Pasolini's ideas. Many European thinkers and American educators influenced by them believe students could learn best by direct experience, that is, using by their sense of the relating new learning to their previous knowledge. As a result, some schools incorporated more physical activity and manual training in the curricula. This innovation was designed not to train technical workers, but rather to complement and round out traditional intellectual instruction. Maria Montessori was particularly influential in developing a curriculum that emphasized learning through the sense of for young children. The theories exposed by Froebel, Priscilla, Herbert, and Mitchell, among others, entered American education through their influence on issues of curriculum. The Progressive Education Association. John Dewey, what are philosophical foundations of American education, and other educators tried to create new experimental child-centered schools in the early 1900s. In 1919, the Progressive Education Association was established in a formalized attempt to reform education according to the following principles. 1. The child should have freedom to develop naturally. 2. Natural interest is the best motive for work. 3. The teacher is a guide, not a taskmaster. 4. A student's development must be measured scientifically, not just by grades. 5. Students' general health and physical development require attention. 6. The school and home must work together and meet children's needs. 7. The progressive school should be a leader in trying new educational ideas. Early forms. Latin grammar schools. In the colonial period, all secondary education, that is, all education beyond the elementary level, served the sole purpose of preparing for entrance to college. The earliest secondary institution was a Latin grammar school, whose name gradually came to mean college preparatory school. The term prep school still carries that classical connotation today. A boy entered a Latin grammar school around age 7 or 8 and spent the next 7 years learning Latin and Greek from the texts written by the ancient Romans, Greeks, and medieval scholars. Much work was memorized, and over 3 or 4 years each student learned composition and writing of Latin verses. He also might have given some attention to the study of the Hebrew language in the New Testament. The first Latin grammar school in the colonies is generally considered to have been one of the established sections in Boston. It was public and open to boys of all the social class. The old Doodler-Saint Act of 1647, which required communities of 50 or more families to establish elementary schools, also required communities of 100 or more families to establish Latin schools. At first, Latin grammar schools were found primarily in New England. A bit later, they emerged in the middle colonies. English grammar schools. The growth of middle-class businesses in the 1700s led to the demand for a secondary education that would provide practical instruction in everything from navigation and engineering to bookkeeping and foreign languages. To meet this demand, private English grammar schools were established. These schools catered by the growing number of those students who need more elementary instruction but were not interested in preparing for college. Classes were offered at all various times and places, sometimes to both in girls. Commercial rather than religious subjects were taught. Some subjects, such as music, art, and dancing, were actually not practical but were meant to train students for socializing in polite company. Secondary education for females. In the 1700s, private venture English grammar schools were more flexible than the Latin grammar schools. As a result, were the first secondary institutions to accept female students. Depending on the sophistication of the particular school and the preferences of the clientele, girls typically studied the 3 arts: reading, writing, and arithmetic, geography, and French, but they also sometimes learned English grammar and history and Latin. Some practical vocational subjects, such as bookkeeping, were occasionally taught, along with such traditional and socially accepted skills as art and traditional music. Because of somewhat larger number of private venture schools in the middle colonies, girls who lived there probably had greater educational opportunities than girls elsewhere. Quaker leaders, including William Penn and French-born Anthony Bennett, were concerned with the social and education of several deprived groups such as African Americans and American Indians and women. In the South, the daughters of wealthy landowners could receive traditional instruction in the various arts and letters such as music, dancing, French, and would be given them social skills appropriate for the lady of a household. By the end of the colonial period, separate class-based education tracks were developed for girls similar to those boys for the English or Latin grammar schools. The public high school. Although private academics reflected the democratic democratic independence of the middle class, their tuition fees effectively ruled out enrollment of members of the poor working class. In the years following the American Revolution, the growing demand for free public elementary education understandably provided a basis on which to advocate for the free secondary education. Such schooling at a public expense was the educational system most appropriate for democracy. It was argued, and the only system that could maintain democracy. Although by no means universally accepted, the argument for free public high schools was a logical one based on the inequality of proving elementary schools for everyone, but secondary schools only for those who offered tuition. In 1821, Boston created the first public school, English high school. A second one for girls was established in 1826. Unlike the academics, high schools were governed by the public rather than by private schools boards. The number of public high schools throughout the states increased slowly but steadily as an extension of the common school system. Not everyone favored their spread. Opponents of the idea of public high schools did not dispute the need for common elementary schools, but did not argue that secondary school was a luxury and was not within the domain of the taxing authorities in 1874 in the famous Kalamazoo case. And Michigan courts finally ruled in the school district could tax public to support both high schools and elementary schools. This court case set the precedent for financing public schools. Before the Civil War. As is true of colonial education generally, the earliest motivation to educate African Americans was religious. In New England, the Reverend Cotton Mather started an evening school for slaves as nearly as 1717. In the South, for the first attempts to educate African Americans were carried out by clergy, particularly English representation of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. To dubious slave owners, ministries defend the education of slaves not only as a religious duty to save their souls, but also because conversation of Christianity, it was believed, would make them more docile. In the North, schools were established for free African Americans in 1731. Anthony Benson, a French-born Quaker, started a school for slave and free African American children in Philadelphia. In 1774, another school was begun by Benjamin Franklin as president of the Abolitionist Society. In 1787, an African free school was established in New York City with an enrollment of 40 students, which grew to more than 500 by 1820. The city provided funds in 1824 and took over the school in 1834, thus providing education for African Americans before many white children were receiving it. Yet conditions were not all bright in the North. In 1833, Prudence Crandall, a white schoolmistress of Cambridge, Connecticut, began to take in African American girls. The villagers boycotted the school, threw manure into its well, and tried to burn it down. Finally, a mob broke the windows and the school was closed. In the South, following slave rebellions in the early 1800s, states gradually prohibited altogether the teaching of African American children, whether the slave or free. Some slaves were taught to read by favorably disposed masters. More generally, slave-owned reasoned with the reading would lead to thinking, and thinking would lead to desire for freedom. As the Civil War approached, abolitionist agitation often emerged in the new liberal right colleagues. The 20th century. The fact that Southern schools and African Americans were not equal to those for whites is woefully clear from looking at the financial expenditures alone. In 1912, the Southern states, as a group, paid white teachers slightly more than 10 per white child in a school, but African American teachers less than 3 African American child. In the 1930s, in 10 Southern states, African American children accounted for 34% of the school population, but received only 3% of the funds available for school transportation. Discrimination also existed in the distribution of federal funds, particularly in vocational education, the largest and most important educational program subsidized by the federal government. Big city desegregation. A major obstacle in desegregating big city public schools is that the minority percentage of the inner city populations has increased dramatically during the past several decades. In part, this trend has been the result of white flight, the exodus of the white residents as parents have chosen to remove the suburbs or to place their children in private schools. This term is somewhat misleading. However, it's not only whites are fleeing, but the city schools. Middle-class African Americans are also leaving to give their children a chance to be educated in better schools. In addition, several Supreme Court decisions during the 1900s dramatically reversed school desegregation plans ordered by lower courts, thereby eliminating much of the pressure to segregate schools. In these rulings, the court essentially concluded that the practical limits exist as to what federal court can do to remove private discrimination. One, school districts have corrected the initial racial imbalances. They are not required to remedy subsequent imbalances caused by demographic changes. In 2007 ruling, the Supreme Court, by the 5-4 margin, further backed away from desegregation's effort by striking down the plans in Seattle and Louisville that sought to maintain school by school diversity by identifying students by race and assigning them to schools and on the classification. Desegregation versus immigration. Another point must be made before we close this discussion. Namely, desegregation does not necessarily lead to integration. True integration is a very human process that can occur only after desegregation has gone into effect. It happens when people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds learn to be comfortable with one another and then get along. Integration means ending racial prejudice and respecting ethnic differences. Anyone who has spent time in racially mixed schools, especially high schools, know that the African American and white students who attend the same school can be extremely distant from one another. Just bringing together students from different racial groups, social classes, and neighborhoods backgrounds was not automatically led to friendship, understanding, and appreciation of one another. As long as the larger society remains segregated, efforts to integrate schools are more likely to reduce tension, at least in the short run. Education of Asian Americans. The diversity of Asian Americans is evident from the historical beginnings of different groups of Asian Americans in the United States and it persists in educational issues today. The three largest groups of Asian Americans are individuals of Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese heritage. Many Asian Americans benefited from greater job opportunities during the post-World War II expansion of the U.S. economy. Previously established immigration restrictions was lifted in 1965 and the influx of Asian immigrants greatly increased. Since the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, enormous numbers of Indonesian immigrants also journeyed to the United States and entered our school systems. Many recent Asian American immigrants to the United States have little or no knowledge of the English language. 64% of 1.3 million Asian students spoke a language other than English at home. This issue creates formidable language and cultural barriers for the students entering the U.S. educational system, and it may lead to serious family school discontinuities, alienation from school, and a dropout problem. The Supreme Court established the law versus Nichols. The schools must offer students sufficient special instruction to be afforded equal educational opportunity. Parental and community involvement of Asian Americans in the education process also should be fostered, in part because the respect traditionally accorded to the educators in the native countries, parents of Asian Americans, students often to intervene when they are dissatisfied with their children's educational progress instead of deferring to their educational system's authority. Another deterrent to parental perception is the fact that a high proportion of Asian American families have two parents employed, a situation that makes attendance at a traditional teacher conferences or parent organizations. And the end.